Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Jayant Singh and I have the distinct pleasure to be your MC for today's event. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, I warmly welcome you to day one of ISAS's 9th International Conference 2014. This year's conference theme is the States of South Asia, and to start off the two-day conference, I now invite Professor Tan Tai Yong, Director, Institute of South Asian Studies, and nominated Member of Parliament, Republic of Singapore, to deliver his opening remarks. Professor Tan is also the Executive Vice President of Yale NUS College and the Vice Provost of the National University of Singapore. Professor Tan, please.
Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, on behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this 9th ISAS International Conference, which is our annual flagship event. Now, for those of you who have been following our conferences in the past, you will know that our annual meetings have two main characteristics. First, our conferences invariably adopt a broad regional South Asian perspective, and we have always been very fortunate to offer Singapore as a productive meeting ground for scholars and policymakers from all parts of the region to converge and conference here. Second, we complement broad regional perspectives with close and deep analysis of developments in individual countries of the region, seeking to understand current developments and trends that are influencing economic and political outcomes in these individual countries of the region. This year's conference will adopt a similar approach. It will focus on the theme of the states of South Asia. By states of South Asia, we not only mean South Asian states, but also the nature of federalism in these states. We believe that these states within each South Asian country and the nature of the relationship between the central government and the subnational political units is critical both for national consolidation and development. One could ask, for instance, if India could have survived as a nation state had it not been reorganized into several subnational states during the 1950s and beyond. And in this regard, we are happy to note that two of our speakers today, Professor K.C. Suri from Hyderabad and Professor Ganesh Kodesia from NUS, will address the issue of evolution and division of two large Indian states, Andhra Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh. The conference will also reflect on a trajectory of significant Indian states that remain undivided. Maharashtra was not only at the forefront of the Indian nationalist and reform movements, its capital city, Mumbai, is the commercial capital of India. Professor Suhas Palshekar from Pune will reflect on political changes in the state of Maharashtra and the social basis of those changes. An important and rapidly growing state that has engendered citizen well-being is the southern state of Tamil Nadu, where DMK and ADMK parties have been driven by Dravidian movement. Dr. Vijay Bhaskar from Chennai in India will enlighten us about the relationship between the government's welfare orientation and the labor regime in Tamil Nadu. There are states with distinctive and long-standing economic models that have shaped their personality and outlook, and in this regard, we want to look at the Indian state of West Bengal and see how communism has survived in that state since beyond the Cold War. And Dr. Dwaipan Bhattacharya from Kolkata will tell us how the former communist government struggled with the idea of growth, having successfully redistributed land in the late 1970s. The conference will also offer the opportunity to study not only Indian but South Asian federalism as well. Would Pakistan have looked different had it been more genuinely federal? And here Dr. Asim Sajjad Akhtar from Islamabad, who is also a research fellow at ISAS, will enlighten us about the implications of Pakistan's federalism for its national consolidation. Dr. Harini Amarasuriya from Colombo in Sri Lanka will address the relationship between the Sri Lankan government and the Tamil majority states within the Sri Lankan Union. What are the implications of this relationship for Sri Lanka's national consolidation and development? We will also look at Bangladesh, and here Professor Niaz Ahmad Khan from Dhaka will reflect on challenges to devolving power to the local level in Bangladesh. Beyond our academic deliberations, we felt that it would be helpful if we could also hear from practitioners who are at the forefront of running states. In this regard, We are indeed privileged to have, as part of the conference program, a dialogue with Mr. Chandrababu Naidu, Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, tomorrow. Mr. Naidu was hailed as the CEO of Undivided Andhra Pradesh and is now at the helm of a divided state. It's not a coincidence that two of America's leading political scientists used the term the iconization of Chandrababu to connote the emergence of powerful chief ministers in the post-liberalized Indian economy after 1991. So we'll have an opportunity to interact with him tomorrow. As with all good conferences, you need a strong keynote speaker to frame the overarching thrust and underlying themes of the deliberations. We are therefore delighted to have Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta grace our conference. Professor Mehta, President of the Center for Policy Research, one of India's most distinguished think tanks, is well known as one of India's leading public intellectuals whose writings have the power to sway public policy debates in a whole range of issue areas. It's always a privilege to interact with Professor Mehta, and I'm proud to announce that he has taken up a short visiting stint at ISAS, and his schedule permitting, we hope that we will see more of him in Singapore in the coming years. We look forward to his keynote this afternoon. I wish everyone a productive and stimulating conference, and it is now my pleasure to invite Professor Mehta to give his keynote address.
Thank you, Professor Tan Tai Yong, for that very generous introduction. Your leadership of education institutions and I guess now your public service and your scholarship, that combination has always been an example to many around the world. And it's wonderful to see NUS, ISAS flourish in the way that they are, really fostering a very unique kind of intellectual conversation. So it's both a privilege and humbling to be here. Giving a keynote speech at a conference like this with so many distinguished speakers to follow and scholars to follow is always a challenging task. Partly because, you can't match the detail of scholarship that is about to come. And so what I thought I'd do for the next, 25 minutes or so, is try and lay out a framework for how we might think of India at this particular moment. What are the questions we should be asking, and what can we say tentatively about those questions? As I'm sure is familiar to many of you, there's a great deal of expectation about India at this moment. India is witnessing arguably its most significant political transition since independence. On every measure of that transition that you can imagine, the nature of political campaigning is changing. The structure of political power has changed. For the first time in a long time, India has a government that has a majority in the lower house of parliament. The structure of the party system is changing. I mean, if you are in Delhi, and I've been in Delhi now back, 13, 14 years, the sense of, something really shaking out the system is palpable. And frankly, we don't know where all the chips are going to fall. It's almost as if you're seeing a kind of big wave lash the shores. And when big waves come, a good deal of rubbish comes with it as well. But the point is that wave going to actually transform, as it were, this beachhead against which it's lashing? It's just hard to underestimate, I think, the significance of this moment. And the question I'm going to ask in the next 20 minutes or so is, what does this mean for India? What kind of transition do we expect, from what to what? At what pace do we expect that transition? And I'll end with a couple of kind of cautionary notes about what might actually go wrong with this story. Right? Now, we are in Singapore, and I think it's appropriate always, whenever addressing an audience in Singapore, even in an academic audience, is to begin with the big economics picture. Right? I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the economic backdrop against which Mr. Modi rose to power, because that gives a framing question for what can we expect as follows. It's no exaggeration to say that the last 3 to 4 years were almost a near disaster for the Indian economy. 6 years of 10% plus inflation, right? for the first time in 2 decades, 2 successive years of under 5% growth, a near balance of payments crisis, right? A near banking crisis, right? Okay. The extent of macroeconomic threat to India, I don't think it's actually appreciated even in India, how fragile and precarious India's macroeconomy had become, right? And as we know, in a sense, macroeconomy is the backdrop against which then everything, in a sense, else follows. That sense of economic anxiety about India's future was the backdrop against which the previous general election was fought. And there were, in a sense, 2 overarching themes in that general election. To put it somewhat simplistically, the one theme was policy paralysis, right? There was a sense that the previous UPA government, right, was in the grip of a policy paralysis that was slowing down India's political prospects. And the second major theme was what you might say is a fear of plutocracy, which was the idea that the Indian political system and economic system had its core got so corrupt and was locked in such a vicious cycle of corruption that its entire legitimacy was about to come into question, right? And the big question was, could India make a transition from policy paralysis to policy action, and a transition from a plutocratic capitalist model to a more efficiently rule of law, order-based regulated capitalism, right? That's the big framing story. Now, of course, underneath this big framing story, there were also lots of interesting local stories. Suhas Palsekar has written very powerfully about the fact that BJP's mobilizing strategy in different states sometimes spoke in different voices. In UP in particular, there was an undertone of communal mobilization. But the national narrative, by and large, was structured around these 2 themes. And so where are, in a sense, we on this transition? Is India going to make a transition from this kind of crony capitalism to what, for want of a better word, may I call a better, well-regulated capitalism? Now, to see the importance of that question, I think it's worth remembering one interesting fact about the Indian economy at this moment. And again, you know, when most of us do our piecemeal research, we forget the significance and the scale of this fact. Imagine an economy where 65 to 70% of the economy was under the grip of complete regulatory malfunction, right? What do I mean by that? Which is, these were areas of the economy where markets could not work, sometimes for good reason, because these are not areas of the economy where you can institutionalize a market and should not institutionalize a market. But even the alternative to a market, right, which is some kind of state intervention, administered price, regulatory structure, was not working, right? So think of an economy where all the factors of production cannot be priced by any mechanism, right? Real estate, natural resources, spectrum. I would argue even education. Actually, I would even put education in this mix. We can talk about it later, right? Energy, electricity, right? Infrastructure contracting, which requires a certain, right? Think of what would happen to an economy if this entire range of sectors was under complete regulatory malfunction. And I'm not advocating necessarily that markets take over the functioning of these. All I'm saying is markets are not functioning in this economy, and there is no credible state mechanism for pricing factors of input. What would happen to such an economy, right? India was exactly in this situation in the last 2 or 3 years. Right? To just give one measure of how complicated this regulatory landscape is, the previous government, I think, had about 45 major economics cases go up to the Supreme Court. It lost almost every single one of them, right? Add to this the fact that India needs to move towards a new and credible environmental protection regime. Our current regime is the worst of all worlds. It doesn't protect the environment, but it actually raises the cost of business. It does both, manages to do both, right? Add to this that fact, and you say, how is this economy going to grow, right? How is a businessman going to invest, right? One more layer in this. Most big loans and big investments in India, right, that happened over the preceding 10 years of the UPA were premised on two things. They were premised either on the fact that India would grow at 8%, right? So that's the calculations you've done in setting up these mega power plants in pricing power. Or they were premised on the fact that if you could bid low, you could somehow negotiate with government, renegotiate with government, and re-enter into those contracts, whether it's in the infrastructure sector, road sector, power sector. Imagine again what would happen if those two assumptions turned out to be false. 8% growth dips to 5%, and the premises on which you had bid for those power projects were no longer financially tenable, right? What you would have is basically something close to a banking crisis, right? The credit concentration, we're talking about something like 120,000 crores in just 8 companies alone, right? Whose projects are, in a sense, they're not unviable projects, right? But they are on hold. This is, in a sense, the backdrop against which this government came to power. And my first sort of submission to you, the first transition we need to think about is, can this government bring about the necessary regulatory transition that this 60 to 70% of the economy is at least under some tolerable and predictable regimen of rules, where you can do price discovery, either through the market or through some credible state-administered mechanism, right? Right now, both of those are broken. It's not that the state can fix a price and stick with it, right? Now, my own sense is that I think, given how committed this government is to at least an 8% growth target, and that's the minimum India needs if it's to absorb the large numbers of young people coming onto the job market. I think it is going to try and, in a sense, let's put it this way, clean up the system, and some small steps have taken place in that direction. Under pressure from the financial crisis, the previous government had already, in a sense, deregulated diesel prices, or was beginning to deregulate diesel prices. Now that's fully deregulated. Finally, they look like they're going to have some grip on gas prices. They're working hard on the electricity sector, where there's a promise of 24/7 electricity in 5 to 7 years. But what I would submit to you is that this transition is not going to be as easy as this government recognizes. And for one very particular reason. That one of the lessons of UPA's economic mismanagement is that the regulatory structure in India has become extraordinarily complicated. It was always complicated, but usually it was complicated because bureaucrats made it complicated. Now it's complicated because the structure of institutions, in particular, independent regulatory agencies, tribunals, and judiciaries, right, have made crafting a regulatory structure much, much more difficult. And I think the joker in the pack in cleaning up this regulatory system is, to my mind, actually going to be the judiciary, right, which to me remains an extremely capricious and uncertain actor in this regulatory world. Now, the good news is, if the government puts up a credible, good faith regulatory system, the judiciary will give, I think, the executive a free pass, right? But there is still a big question mark over to what extent does the judiciary actually understand what it will take to require clean regulatory system. That's number one. Number two, and this is my slight worry about this government at the moment, whether the government understands that it cannot do business as usual, which is in the way in which it crafts legislation, it crafts policy, it crafts contracts even. It takes on board the new legal and regulatory realities that are out there anyway. And I'll just give one example because this is a big one, which is the environment, right? I think there's an urgency in this government about diluting environmental laws partly to promote business. My own sense is if they do that too quickly, institutions like the National Green Tribunal, like the Supreme Court, will likely hold them into account. As one of my colleagues says, he says, India's problem is we are always postponing reckoning with the long run. We always want a shortcut, right? But the long run has caught up with us when it comes to regulation and institution. I think in some areas, as I said, power sector, you will see a lot more progress. But I think the jury is still out whether this government understands the nuances of what it will take to create a regulatory system. So that's one transition, right? Second transition, and the rest I'll sort of be brief about. The second transition we have to think about is what you might call the kind of secrecy to transparency transition. If you look at the Indian state, right, prior to, I mean, you can take any cutoff date, and this is an ongoing process. But the structure of the Indian state, its administrative mechanisms, were founded on what I call 4 principles, which are no longer tenable, right? The Indian state depended on vertical accountability rather than horizontal accountability, right? If you asked a question, who can hold whom accountable, the short answer was somebody superior to you, some boss in the system. If you had satisfied your boss, you were actually okay in this system, right? The second feature of the system was secrecy, relative secrecy. And by that, I don't mean just the fact that government decisions were often taken untransparently in secret, but the fact that the government sat on knowledge which was relevant to decision making, and civil society was not in a position to produce that knowledge. One of the big revolutions of the last 10 years, which UPA initiated but then fell victim of that very revolution, was that the information order has changed drastically. Thanks to the Right to Information Act, if a government acts on the presumption that something will be secret, it's going to come to grief at some point pretty soon. But more importantly, civil society now generates much of the knowledge that causes social agitation in the first place. 15, 20 years ago, if the government didn't tell you your water was poisoned, nobody else was telling you your water was poisoned, right? Now, in a sense, you know, civil society groups will do it. 10 years ago, if government didn't tell you how your kids were performing in school, whether there were any output measures, you know, nobody else would tell you. Now an organization like Pratap will tell you, right? And I think a government has to come to terms with this new information order and ground its legitimacy in this new reality, right? So vertical accountability, information. The third feature of traditional administrative governance was very wide discretion. Now, all governments require discretionary power. I mean, if there were no discretion in government, you could put robots in government, right? So I don't think we should be under the illusion that you can do away with discretion. But under changing democratic circumstances, the question of who do you have to justify the exercise of this discretion to, and the range of actors demanding that justification. Again, civil society, regulatory agencies, courts, auditor generals. That range of institutions has widened considerably, right? So you can't simply say, I've exercised my discretion and satisfied my boss, end of story, right? And the fourth feature was excessive centralization, right? Despite a lot of power dissolving to the states politically, and I'll come to this point in a second because that's the main theme of this conference. The fact of the matter was, financially and administratively, India remained one of the most centralized democracies in the world, right? Centrally sponsored schemes, which were a constitutional usurpation in a significant way, where the central government actually designed and micromanaged, right, large social sector schemes, right, were one example of that centralization. And one of the things we've learned in the last 3 or 4 years that if you govern India based on these principles, you're going to come to grief very soon. It's not going to be enough to have vertical accountability. there is a horizontal accountability movement happening in India all over the place, which has to be taken into account. The information order is changing. Discretion now has to be backed by public reason, which frankly, actually, a lot of the civil service was not used to. How do you actually justify the taking of a decision in public in ways that actually persuade a lot of these different agencies that can hold you accountable, right? And precisely because civil servants weren't used to doing that, there was a kind of policy paralysis, right? I'll be held responsible no matter what I say, right? And finally, as I said, centralization. I think the interesting question about this government is, can it accomplish that transition from a hierarchical, secret-ridden government, wide public discretion, centralized government, to a form of administration that is more transparent, more horizontally accountable, does not depend on as many information distortions, and is more decentralized in some ways. That's the second transition, and I think we are just at the beginnings of that. I think the jury is out in this one. But I just want to say a word about the centralization-decentralization dialectic, because a lot of people argue, quite rightly, that at one level, this is one of the most centralized governments we are going to see, to the extent that power is concentrated in one person. And frankly, not since Jawaharlal Nehru's days. I mean, people cite Indira Gandhi as a model, but I think we forget how centralized Jawaharlal Nehru's administration was as well, right? Has there been a figure who has his own independent source of legitimacy in mass politics, to the extent that Mr. Modi does, with almost no rival, at least at the moment, right? And his governing style is extremely centralizing. There's no question about it. And to that extent, the BJP will start resembling the Congress party pretty soon in the way chief ministers are appointed. Nehru used to impose chief ministers on states like Madhya Pradesh. You're beginning to have that in the BJP as well. But one of the interesting questions on the centralization story, and I'll put it out as a proposition, maybe we can discuss it over the next 2 days, is I think we need to distinguish between 3 kinds of centralization. There's political centralization, there's administrative centralization, and there's fiscal centralization. One of the big mistakes in the centralization debate in India is that we often thought all 3 went together. So people say power is devolved to the states. What does that mean? Does it mean it is devolved administratively? Does it mean it is devolved politically? Right? My own hypothesis is that you're going to get a lot of political centralization because you now have a national party in command with an important leader who is his own source of legitimacy. But paradoxically, political centralization is exactly what allows greater administrative and fiscal decentralization. In the last budget of the UPA, you began to get glimmers of this, where more and more monies were going to be allocated to the state in terms of block grants, rather than centrally sponsored schemes very greatly tied to central design, central micromanagement. I expect that trend to continue. We also expect another trend to continue where states will now be given much more legal leeway to adapt central legislation to their own needs. I mean, there's a debate about right to education, how different states are promulgating different rules. No matter what you think of Rajasthan's recent reforms on labor law, we can talk about whether those reforms are the right ones. But what is interesting about it is the fact that a state has been allowed to modify and carve out, right, what was kind of generally considered an exception to a central, at least ethos on labor regimes. I mean, labor has always been a state's, and that the fact that the president gave assent to that bill. So my own sense is that you will see a lot of political centralization, there's no question about it. But you may actually get more administrative and fiscal decentralization as things proceed. So I'm sticking my neck out on this one. Right? So in a sense, this is the third transition, centralization to decentralization. Where are we on this? The fourth transition that we have to make is, as I said, the transition against plutocracy, right? Can India move from a self-destructive crony capitalism, right, to a more regulated form of capitalism. And again, I'm not taking a normative stance on regulated capitalism, but I think this much everybody would agree on, that well-regulated capitalism is more desirable than crony capitalism, right? Now, there are two lines of kind of inquiry here. One, which is the skeptical one, which basically says, look, and this is a dominant narrative about this government. This is a government beholden to big business. Big business financed a lot of BJP's political activity. Whether we like it or not, you know, in America we used to talk about banks being too big to fail. India ended up in a situation where we had businesses too big to fail. And that was the vicious circle of power they exercised, right? Two companies controlling about 40% of our petrochemical processing, right? 6 companies, right, garnering about 50% of all available bank credit, right? So the way you handle these companies, even if you actually want to clean up the system, is by its very nature going to be a very delicate task, right? I'm actually a little bit more optimistic than the skeptics in the sense that I don't expect a radical break in the sense of, you know, tomorrow you're going to get a whole bunch of crony capitalists in prison or that kind of dramatic populist cleaning up of the system. But I think one thing is very palpable, even in this government, with all its power, centralized power, is that the effects of the anti-corruption campaigns over the last 2 or 3 years, even though the political party that articulated that campaign, the Aam Aadmi Party, is struggling, even though that political party is struggling, the effect of that campaign on the psychology of the government has been profound. In fact, if you ask the question, what is it that this government fears most at the moment, right, given its unassailed power? I think the short answer would be what it fears is a really, really major scandal. Because that would, in a sense, again unleash exactly that kind of civil society mobilization against plutocracy. So it's in their interest. As I said, there won't be a kind of dramatic turnaround because, you know, this regulatory system needs to be cleaned up bit by bit. But I think we have reached a new threshold. Remember, the number of chief ministers now under conviction and in jail or in bail, Jayalalitha, Chautala, Lalu Prasad, is actually growing exponentially, right? Again, we can argue about the justice and merits of each individual case, but in a way, the system recognizes much more that the political costs of big scandals is actually going to be higher. So I think that's the good news in a way, right? In what form is this anti-corruption drive going to be manifested? For my money, I think 2 very concrete proposals, which the government is talking about, and if they are enacted, will send a very powerful signal. The first is making Aadhaar number mandatory for real estate transactions. Real estate, as you know, is the single biggest source of black money in the Indian economy, right? And in fact, one of the strongest arguments for Aadhaar, which is this universal identification scheme that the UPA government had started, is actually not that it will let you target poor people more effectively. It works better with a universal scheme, not with a targeting scheme. In fact, the political economy of Aadhaar is that if Aadhaar is made mandatory for PAN cards and real estate transactions, it will be the single most significant assault on India's privilege and its ways of laundering money that you'll have seen for a generation. Right? In fact, that is why there was a lot of opposition to Aadhaar. Right? So they're talking about this. We hope, you know, that's enacted. Just quickly, two last points very quickly. So this corruption was the other transition. The 5th transition is, let's put it this way, no liberal democracy cannot afford to be a welfare state of some kind. This fantasy that a lot of right-wing Indian commentators had, that somehow we would get a kind of libertarian, Hayekian government which would dismantle welfare state and social support, that was never politically on the cards. It's never been the BJP state government's DNA, and frankly, that position has no legitimacy in a liberal democracy like India's, right? You will have to constantly send strong signals that those who are not able to benefit from growth, right, are allowed to participate in the growth process. The debate is going to be about whether you're using the most efficient means to do it or not. It will not be reflected merely in fiscal allocations, but in the design of those schemes. And I think here, again, we are at this interestingly tantalizing moment where, contrary to what most people feared and statements that were out in the press 2 or 3 weeks ago that the government was going to roll back the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, it is actually not, right? But I think what the government is preparing for is using Aadhaar, this universal identification scheme, combined with this Jan Dhan Yojana, which basically for the first time is providing bank accounts to crores of people who did not have bank accounts, is to create a platform which gives the government more options in terms of how to transfer subsidies to the poor. And the emphasis will be on creating subsidies that allow them to participate in the economy, right? Rather than subsidies that simply define the, as it were, the horizon of social existence. I think one of the Congress Party's biggest political mistakes was they presented the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act as a kind of aspirational ceiling. Look, this is what government has done for you. Whereas most people think it's a floor, not a ceiling, right? So I suspect in a range of things, right? And let's be clear, in order, for example, to experiment with direct cash transfers, you simply did not have the platforms in place, right? That you will see a bit more of a transfer to a, let's put it this way, more cash-based subsidy regime across a range of sectors, particularly fertilizer and gas, over the course of the next 2 or 3 years. But the quantum of subsidies, quantum of state allocation on social sectors is actually not going to be reduced as a proportion, right? So can we make a transition from, let's say, a populist, in the bad sense of the term populist, social welfare regime to a social welfare regime that creates more sort of participation? And the last and final transition, there were a lot of apprehensions about this government. What would this government's external orientation be, right? Mr. Modi surprisingly has given a lot of attention to foreign policy, both in terms of time and effort. And I think the broad direction that is emerging is very clear. India is going to remain committed to a deeper integration with the world economy and more globalization. I won't be surprised if at the G20 you see India announce a compromise on the WTO issue, where India has been holding up the trade facilitation agreement until the question of food security is resolved. And my sense is that India will get a permanent free pass on the food security issue, and in return will commit to a trade facilitation agreement. You are seeing probably the single largest effort at South Asian regional economic integration that you have seen in almost 2 decades. And I think you will see it borne out by the declarations in Kathmandu. The fact that South Asia is actually signing a motor vehicles agreement, which will allow for the seamless movement of vehicles from all our neighboring countries into India, including trucks, much against the chagrin of the security establishment, I should say, by the way, right? Incredible commitment to regional integration of the kind we've actually never seen, which opens up interesting possibilities in a sense for Singapore. The government's main priority is to get growth up. For growth, it realizes it needs investment and openness. India is signaling very tentatively a change in its position on climate change, and I think with the deal struck between the US and China yesterday, the possibility of India changing its position also increases. So all in all, I would say that the broad framework within which the government seems to be moving, right, does give some grounds for cautious optimism, right? The growth rate is picked up, but only marginally. We expect it to be about 5.5% this year, maybe going up to 6% next year. Mr. Modi is extremely lucky. He's extremely lucky in the sense that most of his opponents tend to self-destruct without his doing anything. But global oil prices are coming down. Global food prices are coming down, which does create an interesting opportunity in terms of food inflation. So he has about a 1.5 year window. And if you look around the world, right, China's growth very, very strong as always, but slowing down marginally. US, tentative recovery. Europe in doldrums. Latin America actually going down. India has about as propitious an international climate as it has had. And I think, I hope they make the most of it. What are my two worries? And I'll just end with this note. My two worries about this government, I'll put it in summary form in the following, which is, one, I think the Prime Minister himself is showing a political inventiveness that's frankly unprecedented. I mean, you don't have to agree with him, but just if you think about how politics is constructed, right? And social scientists are often the last people to actually understand politics, because social scientists like looking at the past, we like thinking in structures, we like thinking in determination, because if it's not determined, how do we actually predict? Politicians like contingency, change arounds, communication, persuasion, transformation, right? And just to give a small example, if 4 or 5 years ago, somebody had stood up and said that Sajjad Lone, who was, one of the most respected voices of Kashmiri autonomy, would actually give a televised statement saying, not only that he admired Mr. Modi, which maybe he might say for opportunistic reasons, but that Mr. Modi would get the Indian army to actually apologize for a killing in Kashmir? Would any of us would have even remotely believed this to be a possibility? Right? This is exactly what has happened, right? Kashmir elections come, Mr. Modi goes, camps out in Kashmir on Diwali. There is this, potentially could have been a diabolical incident, and the army apologizes. My point is that it's a government that is thinking politically in the truest sense of the term, which is not static in, here's a template, but what is the political, as it were, demand, right, which it actually needs to cater to and feel to. And that's where all its opponents are actually way behind, because they've stopped thinking politically. They're listening to too many social scientists, I think. But having said that, I think the big challenge with this government is the Prime Minister seems to be on a, as I said, a kind of progressive, expansive trajectory. Will they be able to build the support systems to actually execute this transition adequately enough? The Prime Minister is very much an outsider to the system, which is kind of causing a lot of anxiety in a lot of people, because, frankly, most of the establishment doesn't even understand what he's trying to say and do, actually, right? But I think it's going to take a little bit of time for them to figure out what the architecture of this support scaffolding is going to be and needs to be, particularly in light of the administrative requirements that I laid out 10 minutes ago. That it's a very changing administrative landscape which cannot be managed simply by giving old-fashioned directives to bureaucrats. They need to do that in the short run because, you need to generate some kind of decision-making and optimism. But the question of the support scaffolding is an open one. The second worry, which I think needs to be mentioned, the jury is out on this one. As I said, when there is a big wave, a lot of rubbish is also thrown up on the beach. There is no question, given the history of the BJP as a party, and not so much the history of the BJP in particular, but the configuration of local mobilization that it has in particular states, like Uttar Pradesh, for example. Ganesh will probably talk more about this. Let's put it this way, a lot of nasty elements are feeling very empowered at this moment, right? By nasty elements, I mean sort of members of Hindu right-wing organizations who think this is their moment in some ways, right? And are feeling empowered. My own sense is that I don't think they're actually not only not going to be powerful enough, but frankly, I think you're going to see some interesting triangulation strategies to, in a sense, confine them, marginalize them in some long-run sense. I mean, remember, this is a 5 to 10-year game. This is not going to happen over the next 6 months, right? But the fact of the matter is that politics in particular states like UP, right, where at least some sections of the BJP feel there is a political return to what is called control polarization, is very much still, as it were, a possibility. I think the government recognizes that any major incident is going to not just dent its legitimacy, but derail this larger narrative that it wants to give out, right? But it is something that the government, in a sense, will have to politically manage. But I think in conclusion, it's fair to say that it is genuinely a progressive moment in India. A progressive moment in the sense that, you know, and the analogy with the US progressive movement is exactly the right one, which is, can the transition from an arbitrary administrative state on the one hand and a crony capitalist state on the other to a more effective, regulated 21st century capitalism that's enmeshed in a larger global vision, is India on the path to that transition? And I would submit to you, this audience, that I think there's reason to be cautiously optimistic that it is. I'll stop there. I'm sure there are lots of contentions and questions. Be happy to take.